The moment Admiral Parker ordered Captain Irene, Ghost 7 Moon, off Naval Air Station Oceana, he had no idea he was dismissing the most decorated F-22 pilot in classified history. What happened next would shake the entire military establishment to its core. This is the true story of how one woman's courage under fire created a legend that would reshape modern warfare doctrine forever. Stay with me until the end of this incredible journey and let me know in the comments what city you are watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled around the world. The Virginia morning sun cast long shadows across Naval Air Station Oceana as Captain Irene Moon walked through the main gate, her weathered flight jacket hanging loose over civilian clothes. The fabric was faded olive drab, worn thin at the elbows, with patches that had seen better decades. To the casual observer, she looked like any other veteran visiting the base, perhaps a retiree reminiscing about old times, or maybe someone's parent attending a ceremony. Admiral James Parker noticed her immediately. Parker was the kind of flag officer who believed in regulations the way some men believed in religion, absolutely without question, and with zero tolerance for deviation. At 58, he'd built his career on order, discipline, and the unwavering belief that every person had their place and should stay in it. He'd commanded this base for 18 months, and in that time he'd made it clear that Naval Air Station Oceana would run like the precision instrument it was designed to be. "Excuse me," Parker's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. His polished shoes clicked against the concrete as he approached Irene, his dress blues immaculate, despite the early hour. "This is a restricted military installation. I'm going to need to see some identification." Irene turned slowly, her movement measured and deliberate. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, revealing a face that spoke of years spent squinting into distant horizons. Her eyes, a striking gray-green that seemed to shift with the light, met the Admiral's gaze without flinching. "Of course, sir," she said quietly, reaching into her jacket pocket. But Parker wasn't finished. His eyes swept over her civilian attire with obvious disapproval. "And I'll need an explanation for why you're wearing that jacket on my base. Military insignia and patches are not fashion accessories, ma'am." The words hung in the air like smoke from a misfired weapon. Around them, the base was coming to life. Maintainers wheeling equipment across the tarmac, pilots heading to briefings, the distant roar of jet engines warming up for morning sorties. But in this small pocket of concrete and conflict, time seemed to slow. Irene's hand paused at her jacket pocket. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Not anger exactly, but something deeper and more complex. It was the look of someone who had faced far worse than an officious admiral and lived to tell about it. "This jacket," she said softly, her voice carrying the faintest trace of an accent that suggested roots somewhere in the Midwest, "has been with me for quite a while, sir." "That's not what I asked," Parker snapped. His aide, a young lieutenant named Collins, who'd been trailing behind him with a tablet full of morning briefings, shifted uncomfortably. The lieutenant had the distinct feeling he was witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. "I asked for an explanation. Military personnel, active reserve, or retired do not wear partial uniforms with civilian clothing. It's unprofessional, and frankly, it's disrespectful to everyone who's earned the right to wear these insignia properly." Irene finally produced her identification, holding it out with the same calm precision she might use to flip switches in a cockpit. Parker snatched it away, his eyes scanning the plastic card with the intensity of a man looking for ammunition. "Irene Moon," he read aloud. "Retired." He looked up at her with something approaching satisfaction. "Well, Miss Moon, retirement doesn't give you carte blanche to play dress-up on an active military installation. The fact that you once served doesn't mean you can—" "Captain Moon," she corrected gently. Parker's jaw tightened. "Excuse me, Captain Irene Moon, sir, United States Air Force, retired." The Admiral's face flushed red. In his worldview, respect flowed upward through the chain of command like water finding its level. A retired captain, especially one standing before him in civilian clothes and a ratty old jacket, did not correct an admiral. Period. "Captain or not," he said, his voice rising enough to attract attention from passing personnel. "You're out of uniform and out of line. This is Naval Air Station Oceana, not some VFW hall where you can wander around reliving your glory days. I want you off my base, now." The words carried across the morning air like a gunshot. Conversation stopped, heads turned. A group of young Navy pilots heading to their briefing room slowed their pace, sensing drama unfolding. Irene took the identification card back without comment. She looked down at the worn leather of her flight jacket, at patches that had faded until their details were barely visible. Her fingers traced one particular patch on her left sleeve, a ghost white silhouette of an F-22 Raptor with the number 7 beneath it. "I understand, sir," she said finally. "I'll be going." She turned to leave, her posture straight but not rigid, her pace unhurried. There was something in her bearing that suggested this wasn't the first time she'd walked away from a fight, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But as she moved toward the gate, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Washington caught sight of that patch on her sleeve. Washington was a 23-year veteran who'd seen action in 3 different theaters, a man whose instincts had been honed by decades of keeping young sailors alive in dangerous places. He knew military aviation the way some men knew baseball statistics, and what he saw made his blood run cold. "Wait," he called out, his voice sharp enough to cut through the morning noise. "Wait just a damn minute." Irene stopped but didn't turn around. Washington jogged the few steps necessary to reach her. His experienced eyes locked on that faded patch. Up close he could make out details that distance had obscured: the careful stitching, the specific font used for the number, the way the ghost white thread had aged to a soft cream color. "Ghost 7. He whispered so quietly that only Irene could hear him. She turned then, and Washington found himself looking into eyes that had seen things he could only imagine. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Around them, the base continued its morning routine, oblivious to the significance of this quiet exchange. "Chief?" Irene acknowledged with a slight nod. Washington's hand moved instinctively toward a salute before he caught himself. His mind was racing, trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with the stories he'd heard, whispered in classified briefings, the legend that lived in the gray areas between official reports and barrack room rumors. "Ma'am," he said, his voice tight with emotion, "with all due respect, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Admiral Parker, who'd been watching this exchange with growing irritation, strode over to them. "Chief Washington, is there a problem here?" Washington turned to face his commanding officer, and Parker was surprised to see something like anger in the chief's eyes, a cold, controlled fury that spoke of deeply held principles being violated. "Sir," Washington said carefully, "I believe you should know who you're talking to." "I know exactly who I'm talking to," Parker replied, "a retired captain who thinks her past service gives her the right to ignore current regulations." "Admiral, Washington said, his voice dropping to a register that somehow made it more commanding rather than less. "Do you know what Ghost 7 means?" Parker's irritation flared. "I don't care if she calls herself the Red Baron Chief. She's out of uniform and out of place on my Operation Firewall." Washington interrupted a breach of protocol so severe that several nearby personnel stopped dead in their tracks. Afghanistan 2019, the mission that officially never happened. For the first time since the confrontation began, Admiral Parker fell silent. Around them, the morning sounds of the base seemed to fade into background noise. Even the distant jet engines seemed quieter, as if the very air was holding its breath. Irene stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable, but something in her posture suggested she was no longer entirely present, as if part of her had traveled back to a different time, a different place, where the stakes had been measured in lives rather than regulations. "Chief," she said quietly, "that's not necessary." "Yes, ma'am," Washington replied, "I believe it is." He turned back to Admiral Parker, whose face had gone from red to pale in the space of 30 seconds. Sir Ghost 7 was the call sign of the lone F-22 pilot who saved Bravo team during the Kunar province incident. 12 SEALs were about to be overrun by numerically superior forces when she disobeyed direct orders to stay clear of the combat zone. Parker's mouth opened, but no words came out. Washington continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. She flew into hostile airspace alone against overwhelming odds and held off enemy aircraft for 17 minutes while the extraction team reached our people. 3 confirmed kills, multiple probables, and not a single American casualty. The Admiral's aide, Lieutenant Collins, had gone white as paper. He'd heard rumors about Operation Firewall during his time at the Naval War College, stories told in hushed voices about impossible odds and legendary heroism. But those stories had always seemed too fantastic to be true, the kind of tales that grew in the telling until fact became fiction. "That's—" Parker started, then stopped. His gaze shifted to Irene, who was looking past them all toward the flight line where FA-18 Super Hornets sat in neat rows, their sleek forms gleaming in the morning sun. "Impossible," he finished weakly. "No, sir," said a new voice. "Just classified." They turned to see Commander Ryan Blake approaching from the direction of the operations building. Blake was the kind of officer who commanded respect through competence, rather than rank a pilot's pilot, who'd flown combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan before transitioning to intelligence work. His presence immediately shifted the dynamic of the group, adding weight to an already tense situation. Blake's eyes found Irene's, and he nodded slightly, a gesture of recognition between professionals who'd operated in the same dangerous spaces. "Commander Blake," Admiral Parker said, his voice noticeably less certain than it had been moments before. "Perhaps you can explain what's happening here." Blake looked at the small crowd that had gathered, maintenance personnel pretending to work while straining to listen, pilots who'd slowed their pace to see what the commotion was about. Even a few administrative staff who'd found reasons to step outside their offices. "Sir," Blake said carefully, "might I suggest we continue this conversation somewhere more private?" But it was too late for privacy. The story was already spreading through the base's informal communication network with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. Somewhere a young airman was texting his buddy in the tower. A maintenance chief was sharing what he'd overheard with his crew. The legend of Ghost 7 was about to collide with the very real presence of Captain Irene Moon. Admiral Parker looked around at the faces watching him, some curious, some confused, but increasingly some angry. These were people who understood the warrior ethos, who respected courage under fire above all else. And they were beginning to realize that their commanding officer had just insulted someone who embodied everything they aspired to be. "Captain Moon," Parker said, his voice now carefully controlled, "perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." Irene turned back to face him, and for the first time she looked directly into his eyes. What he saw there made him take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't anger or contempt. It was something far more unsettling. It was the calm, measured gaze of someone who had looked death in the face and made peace with it. "No misunderstanding, Admiral," she said quietly. "You asked me to leave your base. I'm leaving." She started walking again, her pace steady and unhurried. But now her movement had a different quality. It was the walk of someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone who had already paid whatever price the universe demanded. Chief Washington watched her go, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Around him, the crowd was growing larger and more restless. Word was spreading faster now, carried by smartphones and whispered conversations. Ghost 7, Operation Firewall, the woman who saved Bravo team. "Sir," Washington said to Admiral Parker, his voice barely controlled, "with respect, you just ordered a Medal of Honor recipient off this base." Parker's face went white. "She has the Medal of Honor." "Classified citation," Commander Blake said quietly. "Most of the details are still sealed, but what Chief Washington told you is accurate. Captain Moon is the most decorated F-22 pilot in Air Force history." The Admiral looked toward the gate where Irene was now approaching the security checkpoint. She moved with the same calm precision she'd shown throughout the entire confrontation, apparently unaffected by the chaos she was leaving behind. But appearance could be deceiving. As she reached the gate, Irene paused and looked back one last time at Naval Air Station Oceana. Her gaze swept across the flight line, taking in the aircraft that represented the cutting edge of American air power. For just a moment, her composure cracked, and those watching could see something deeper. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of profound weariness that came from carrying secrets too heavy for any one person to bear. She thought about the young pilots who would take off from this base in the coming hours, some of them heading into harm's way without fully understanding what they might face. She thought about the SEALs who trained here, men and women who would depend on air support when their missions went sideways. She thought about the lessons she'd learned in those 17 minutes over Kunar province, lessons that could save lives if anyone cared enough to listen. But Admiral Parker had made his position clear. There was no place for her here, no room for the kind of thinking that valued mission success over rigid adherence to protocol. The security guard at the gate, a young sailor who'd overheard enough of the conversation to understand he was witnessing something significant, stepped aside as Irene approached. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "it's been an honor." Irene looked at him, really looked at him, and saw herself 20 years earlier. Young, eager, absolutely certain that the world made sense and that good people were rewarded for doing good things. "Keep your eyes open out there, sailor," she said softly. "And remember, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right when everything goes wrong." She walked through the gate and out of Naval Air Station Oceana, leaving behind a base in turmoil and an admiral who was just beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. Behind her, Chief Washington was already moving toward the operations building, his jaw set with determination. Commander Blake was pulling out his phone, preparing to make calls that would reach all the way to the Pentagon, and Admiral Parker was standing in the middle of the tarmac, watching the most legendary pilot of her generation disappear into the civilian world beyond the gate. What none of them could have predicted was that this moment, this collision between rigid bureaucracy and living legend, would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately transform how the United States military thought about leadership, courage, and the price of doing what's right. The morning sun climbed higher over Virginia, casting new shadows across Naval Air Station Oceana. But the shadow cast by Admiral Parker's decision would stretch much further than any of them imagined, reaching into classified briefing rooms and congressional hearings, into training manuals and military doctrine. The legend of Ghost 7 had just become something more dangerous than myth. It had become truth. The silence that followed Irene's departure stretched across Naval Air Station Oceana like the calm before a storm. Admiral Parker stood motionless on the tarmac, his dress blues suddenly feeling too tight around his collar. The morning sun seemed harsher now, casting sharp shadows that made every imperfection visible, the slight tremor in his hands, the way his confident posture had deflated into something approaching uncertainty. Chief Washington broke the silence first, his voice cutting through the morning air with military precision. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to return to my duties." It wasn't really a request. Washington's 23 years of service had taught him when to push and when to retreat, and right now he could see that Admiral Parker was teetering on the edge of a decision that would define the rest of his career. The chief had said his piece. Now it was time to let the Admiral process what he'd learned. "Chief," Parker called out as Washington began to walk away. "What you said about Operation Firewall, how much of that is common knowledge?" Washington paused, considering his words carefully. Sir, most of the details are classified above my pay grade, but in the special operations community, Ghost 7 is, well, she's legend. SEALs, Rangers, Air Force Special Tactics. They all know the story. Maybe not all the specifics, but they know someone went above and beyond to bring our people home. Commander Blake stepped closer to the Admiral, his voice dropping to a more private register. Sir, I think we need to discuss this situation in your office. There are aspects of Captain Moon's service record that require a higher classification level than we should be discussing out here. Parker nodded absently, his gaze still fixed on the gate where Irene had disappeared. Around them, the base was slowly returning to its normal rhythm, but there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there an hour earlier. Conversations were more subdued glances, more furtive. Word was spreading through the informal networks that connected every military installation, the kind of communication system that could carry news from Virginia to California faster than any official channels. As they walked toward the administrative building, Parker found himself replaying the encounter in his mind. He'd been so certain of his position, so confident in his authority. Regulations were regulations after all. Standards existed for a reason. But now, with each step toward his office, those certainties felt less solid, like sand shifting beneath his feet. The Admiral's office occupied a corner of the second floor, its windows offering a clear view of the flight line. The room reflected Parker's personality, everything in its proper place, awards and commendations arranged with mathematical precision, not a single item that didn't serve a specific purpose. It was the office of a man who believed in order above all else. Commander Blake closed the door behind them and activated the sound dampening system that turned their conversation into unintelligible white noise for anyone who might be listening from the outer office. The precaution spoke volumes about the sensitivity of what they were about to discuss. "Tell me about Operation Firewall," Parker said without preamble, settling into his desk chair with less than his usual confidence. Blake remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back, in a posture that suggested he was about to deliver a briefing that would change everything the Admiral thought he knew about military aviation. Operation Firewall was a joint special operations mission in Afghanistan's Kunar province, September 2019. Blake began, his voice taking on the formal cadence of an intelligence officer delivering classified information. Bravo team, consisting of 12 Navy SEALs, was conducting a high-value target capture mission when they were compromised approximately 40 clicks from friendly forces. Parker leaned forward, his full attention now focused on Blake's words. He'd commanded ships and submarines, but the world of special operations remained largely foreign to him, a shadowy realm where the normal rules of engagement seemed to bend in ways that made traditional naval officers uncomfortable. The target was a Taliban commander who'd been coordinating attacks on coalition convoys. Blake continued. Intelligence suggested he was operating alone, but when Bravo team reached the compound, they found themselves facing nearly 60 hostiles with heavy weapons and air support. Air support, Parker interrupted. The Taliban had aircraft, drones, Blake clarified. Chinese manufactured, armed with anti-personnel rockets. Not sophisticated by our standards, but more than enough to pin down a SEAL team caught in the open. The commander moved to the window, looking out at the FA-18s lined up on the tarmac. Bravo team called for immediate extraction, but the nearest combat air patrol was 30 minutes out. In a firefight like that, 30 minutes might as well be 30 hours. Parker felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. He'd never been in ground combat, but he'd read enough after-action reports to understand what Blake was describing. A small unit outnumbered 5-1 with enemy air assets overhead and no friendly support within range. It was the kind of scenario that ended with flag-draped coffins and somber ceremonies. "That's when Ghost 7 made contact," Blake said quietly. "Made contact with whom? Everyone Bravo Team Tactical Operations Center Regional Command, even CENTCOM. She was flying a routine patrol mission about 100 miles away when she picked up the distress call. Blake turned away from the window, his expression grave. "Sir, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. Captain Moon's actions during Operation Firewall have never been officially acknowledged because they violated standing orders, international airspace agreements, and approximately 15 different rules of engagement." Parker's mouth went dry. What did she do? She went in alone. The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Parker tried to process what he was hearing, to reconcile it with everything he understood about military aviation and chain of command. Fighter pilots didn't simply decide to engage enemy forces without authorization. There were protocols, procedures, chains of approval that existed specifically to prevent unauthorized military action. Without orders, against orders, Blake corrected. Direct orders to maintain patrol route and avoid the combat area. Captain Moon acknowledged the transmission, then immediately changed course toward Kunar province. The commander pulled a tablet from his jacket pocket and activated a secure application that required both fingerprint and retinal scan to access. After a moment, he turned the screen toward Admiral Parker. The display showed a tactical map of eastern Afghanistan with various symbols indicating friendly and hostile forces. A single blue icon labeled Ghost 7 was moving rapidly toward a cluster of red symbols that represented overwhelming enemy strength. "This is the real-time tracking data from that day," Blake explained. "What you're seeing is an F-22 Raptor, arguably the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, flying into a combat zone where it had no business being piloted by an officer who was about to make a decision that would save 12 lives and end her military career." Parker studied the screen, watching the blue icon advance toward what looked like certain destruction. The tactical display was clinical sterile, but he could imagine the chaos it represented: men fighting for their lives while bureaucrats and commanders debated response protocols in air-conditioned operation centers. "The mission parameters were clear," Blake continued. "No American aircraft were authorized to enter Pakistani airspace. The Taliban compound was less than 2 kilometers from the border. Any engagement would be considered an international incident. So she violated Pakistani sovereignty. She obliterated it." Blake's voice carried a note of something that might have been admiration. "Ghost 7 didn't just cross the border, she announced her presence by engaging 4 enemy drones in Pakistani airspace while providing close air support to American forces on the ground." The Admiral set down the tablet, his hands suddenly unsteady. He was beginning to understand that the woman he'd dismissed from his base hadn't simply bent the rules, she'd shattered them completely in service of a higher principle. "The engagement lasted 17 minutes, Blake said, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper. 4 enemy drones destroyed 3 fixed-wing aircraft, engaged and eliminated, and approximately 40 ground targets neutralized. By the time the authorized air support arrived, Bravo Team was secure and Ghost 7 was already heading home. The casualties: 0 American. 12 SEALs who should have died that day went home to their families because one pilot decided that following orders mattered less than bringing our people home." Parker stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the base. Below, he could see normal military life, continuing maintenance crews servicing aircraft pilots, heading to briefings, the ordered routine that he'd spent his career defending. But now that routine felt somehow hollow, mechanical, disconnected from the real purpose of military service. "What happened to her?" he asked, without turning around. Blake was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who understood the price of principled action. Officially, Captain Moon received a letter of reprimand for violating direct orders and engaging enemy forces without authorization. Unofficially, she was quietly transferred to a training position and encouraged to submit her retirement papers. And the Medal of Honor that Chief Washington mentioned, classified citation, The operation officially never happened. Remember, can't give someone a public award for an action that doesn't exist in the official record." Parker turned back toward Blake, his face pale. "So she was punished for saving lives." "She was punished for disobeying orders," Blake corrected carefully. The fact that her disobedience saved lives was considered irrelevant by the review board. "The military runs on discipline, Admiral. When officers start making unilateral decisions about which orders to follow and which to ignore, the entire structure begins to break down." The commander's words echoed with the voice of institutional authority, but Parker could hear something else underneath a tension between the letter of military law and its spirit, between the rules that governed behavior and the values that supposedly justified that governance. "Do you agree with that assessment, Commander?" Blake met the Admiral's gaze directly. "Sir, I believe that's above my pay grade," but his tone suggested otherwise. Parker had been in the military long enough to recognize the careful diplomatic language that officers used when they disagreed with official policy, but couldn't say so directly. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Parker's aide, Lieutenant Collins, appeared in the doorway, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation developing that requires your immediate attention." "What kind of situation?" Collins glanced nervously at Commander Blake before answering. "Sir, word about this morning's incident has reached the Special Operations community. We're receiving calls from multiple commands requesting information about Captain Moon's current status." Parker felt the cold knot in his stomach tighten. "What kind of calls?" "Naval Special Warfare Command, Air Force Special Operations Command, and—" Collins paused, checking his notes. "The Joint Special Operations Command. They're all asking why Ghost 7 was asked to leave the base." The room fell silent except for the distant sound of jet engines warming up on the flight line. Parker could feel the weight of institutional attention beginning to focus on his decision, like sunlight being concentrated through a magnifying glass. "There's more, sir," Collins continued reluctantly. "Social media is starting to pick up the story. Someone posted a video of this morning's confrontation, and it's beginning to go viral in military communities." Blake pulled out his own phone and quickly accessed several social media platforms. After a moment, he looked up with an expression that mixed concern with something approaching awe. "Admiral, you need to see this." He held up his phone, showing a video that had been shot from one of the office windows overlooking the tarmac. The quality wasn't perfect, but it clearly showed Admiral Parker confronting Irene, her calm responses, and the moment when Chief Washington recognized her call sign. "How many views?" Parker asked weakly. "This particular video has about 50,000 in the last hour," Blake replied. "But there are multiple versions circulating across different platforms. The hashtag Ghost7 is trending in military communities." Lieutenant Collins cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, there's one more thing. We've been contacted by a reporter from Navy Times. They're asking for a statement about the incident." Parker sank back into his chair, the full scope of his predicament finally becoming clear. What had started as a simple enforcement of base regulations was rapidly evolving into a public relations nightmare, with implications that reached far beyond Naval Air Station Oceana. His phone rang the secure line that connected directly to higher command levels. Parker looked at the caller ID and felt his heart skip a beat. It was Vice Admiral Rebecca Thompson, Commander of Naval Air Forces Atlantic, his immediate superior and a woman known for her direct approach to problem solving. "Admiral Parker," Thompson's voice was crisp and professional, but Parker could detect an undercurrent of barely controlled anger. "I'm looking at a very interesting video that someone sent me. It appears to show you ordering a highly decorated Air Force officer off your base. Please tell me there's been some kind of misunderstanding." Parker glanced at Blake and Collins, both of whom were studying the floor with intense concentration. There was no good way to answer Thompson's question, no explanation that would make his actions appear reasonable in hindsight. "Ma'am, I was enforcing base regulations regarding proper uniform standards." The individual in question was wearing military insignia with civilian clothing, which is a violation of "Stop." Thompson's voice cut through his explanation like a sword. "Admiral, are you telling me that you ejected Captain Irene Moon from your facility because of a uniform violation? The use of Irene's full name and rank told Parker everything he needed to know about how high up the chain of command this incident had already traveled. Vice Admiral Thompson wasn't calling for clarification, she was calling to assess damage and determine appropriate response. "Ma'am, at the time I was unaware of Captain Moon's service record. She appeared to be a civilian wearing her service record." Thompson's voice rose slightly. "Admiral, Captain Moon's service record is legendary. She's given classified briefings to flag officers about combat decision-making under extreme pressure. Her tactics and techniques are studied at the War College, and you threw her off your base because of a uniform violation." Parker closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his mistake settling around him like a physical presence. He'd built his career on attention to detail, on rigid adherence to standards and regulations. But somewhere along the way, he'd lost sight of the forest for the trees, forgotten that rules existed to serve a purpose rather than as ends in themselves. "Ma'am, You will fix this, Admiral," Thompson interrupted. "I don't care what it takes. You will find Captain Moon, you will apologize, and you will make this right. Is that understood?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. And Admiral, the next time you decide to enforce uniform regulations, I suggest you make sure you know who you're talking to first." Thompson out. The line went dead, leaving Parker staring at the phone as if it were a live grenade. Around him, the carefully ordered world of his office suddenly felt fragile, temporary, like a house of cards, waiting for the next strong wind. Commander Blake cleared his throat diplomatically. "Sir, if I may suggest, Captain Moon was scheduled to visit the base as part of a consulting arrangement with Naval Special Warfare Command. She's been working with various special operations units on tactical innovation and decision-making under pressure. She was here on official business." "Yes, sir. She was supposed to meet with the SEAL training detachment this afternoon to discuss integration of air support with ground operations." Parker felt the last of his confidence crumble. Not only had he insulted a decorated war hero, but he'd interfered with an official military consulting arrangement. The implications were staggering, not just for his career, but for the training programs that could benefit from Irene's expertise. "Where is she now?" Blake checked his phone. "Unknown, sir. She's not answering calls from the special operations community, and her last known location was leaving the base." Lieutenant Collins spoke up hesitantly. "Sir, there might be a way to find her." The video that's circulating online, someone in the comments section mentioned seeing her at a coffee shop about 2 miles from the main gate, a place called The Grind. Parker stood up abruptly, his decision crystallizing with the clarity that sometimes comes in moments of crisis. He'd made a mistake, a significant career-threatening mistake, but it wasn't too late to try to make it right. "Commander Blake, you're with me. Lieutenant Collins, cancel my afternoon appointments and hold all calls except from Vice Admiral Thompson or higher. If anyone asks where I am, tell them I'm handling a personnel matter." As they prepared to leave the office, Parker paused at the door, looking back at the awards and commendations that decorated his walls. They represented a career built on following rules, maintaining order, doing things the way they'd always been done. But standing there, he realized that none of those achievements would matter if he couldn't find the courage to admit when he was wrong. The drive to The Grind took 12 minutes through Virginia Beach traffic that seemed unusually heavy for a Tuesday morning. Parker sat in the passenger seat of Blake's unmarked sedan, watching the civilian world pass by outside the windows. It was a world he'd spent his career defending, but one he rarely took time to actually observe. The coffee shop was exactly the kind of place he'd expect to find near a military base, unpretentious, comfortable with Wi-Fi strong enough to support video calls to deployed family members, and coffee strong enough to keep night shift personnel alert. The parking lot contained a mix of civilian vehicles and cars with military base stickers, creating the kind of neutral ground where service members could temporarily set aside rank and just be people. They found Irene at a corner table, a laptop open in front of her, and a cup of coffee that had clearly been sitting untouched for some time. She was staring out the window, her expression thoughtful rather than angry. There was something in her posture that suggested she was used to being alone, comfortable with solitude in a way that spoke of years spent in isolated cockpits high above hostile territory. She looked up as they approached, and Parker was struck again by those gray-green eyes that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. There was no surprise in her expression, no satisfaction at seeing him come to find her. If anything, she looked tired, not physically exhausted, but worn down by the weight of carrying secrets and fighting battles that most people would never know about. "Admiral Parker," she said quietly, gesturing to the empty chairs across from her. "Commander Blake, please sit down." The simple courtesy of her invitation somehow made Parker feel worse about the morning's encounter. Even now, even after being humiliated and dismissed, she was extending basic human respect to the man who'd wronged her. "Captain Moon," Parker began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Before you say anything," she said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to controlling dangerous situations, "I want you to know that I don't blame you for this morning. You were doing your job as you understood it. Military discipline depends on standards being enforced consistently, regardless of who's involved." Parker felt something tight and painful in his chest. The recognition that she was offering him an exit, a way to save face, even though she owed him nothing. "That's very generous of you, Captain, but it's also incomplete," she continued, her tone sharpening slightly. "Because what happened this morning wasn't really about uniform regulations. It was about something much more fundamental." She leaned forward, and suddenly Parker could see the steel beneath her calm exterior, the backbone that had carried her through 17 minutes of impossible combat. It was about whether we're going to be an organization that values courage and innovation, or one that prioritizes conformity and control. Whether we're going to develop leaders who can think for themselves, or just produce managers who follow checklists. Blake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, recognizing that they were moving into territory that went far beyond the morning's misunderstanding. This wasn't just about an apology anymore. It was about fundamental questions of military culture and leadership philosophy. "The military needs rules," Parker said, feeling compelled to defend the system he'd served faithfully for decades. "Without discipline, without structure, we're just an armed mob." "Absolutely," Irene agreed, surprising him. "But discipline without wisdom is just mindless obedience. Structure without flexibility breaks under pressure. The question is, what happens when the rules conflict with the mission?" She gestured toward the window where they could see the approach pattern for Naval Air Station Oceana. As they watched, an F-18 Super Hornet came in for landing, its twin engines roaring as it touched down on the runway. "That pilot," she said, "spent years learning procedures, memorizing checklists, practicing emergency responses until they became automatic. But when something goes wrong, really wrong, all those procedures become suggestions. What matters then is judgment, courage, and the willingness to do whatever it takes to bring everyone home safely." Parker found himself thinking about Operation Firewall, about the choice Irene had made when faced with 12 Americans about to die and direct orders to stay away. In the comfort of an air-conditioned coffee shop, it was easy to see the moral clarity of her decision, but he tried to imagine himself in that cockpit, listening to desperate voices on the radio, while superior officers commanded him to maintain course and avoid international incidents. "The review board that disciplined you," he said quietly, "they thought you made the wrong choice." Irene's smile was sad and knowing. The review board was concerned about precedent. They were worried that if they condoned my actions, other pilots might start making unilateral decisions about which orders to follow. They weren't wrong to be concerned. "But you'd do it again," It wasn't a question, and she didn't treat it as one. "Every single time," she said without hesitation, "because the moment we become more concerned about following rules than about bringing our people home, we've lost the moral authority to ask anyone to serve." The conversation was interrupted by Blake's phone, which buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "Admiral, we have a situation developing back at the base. Multiple special operations units are requesting immediate meetings with Captain Moon. It appears that word of her presence has spread throughout the community." Irene sighed, a sound that carried years of weariness. "I was afraid this might happen. The special operations community is protective of its own." "What do you mean?" Parker asked. "SEALs, Rangers, Special Forces, they all know the story of Ghost 7. Most of them have served with someone who was there that day or who knew someone who was there. When they hear that she was disrespected." Blake trailed off, but the implication was clear. Parker's phone rang his personal cell this time. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the area code was from Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado. "Admiral Parker, this is Master Chief Marcus Rodriguez, Naval Special Warfare Command. I understand you had an encounter with Captain Moon this morning." The Master Chief's tone was carefully controlled, professional, but Parker could hear something dangerous underneath the voice of a man who'd spent decades in the most elite units of the military and had strong opinions about how heroes should be treated. "Yes, Master Chief, there was a misunderstanding." "Sir, with all due respect, there's no misunderstanding about what I saw in that video. You ordered a Medal of Honor recipient off your base because you didn't like her jacket." Parker glanced at Irene, who was listening to his side of the conversation with an expression of resignation. She'd been through this before, the aftermath of taking principled stands, the way institutional conflicts became personal battles. "Master Chief, I'm currently meeting with Captain Moon to address the situation." "Good. Because, sir, I've got 12 SEALs who owe their lives to that woman, and they're all very interested in making sure she gets the respect she's earned." The line went dead, leaving Parker staring at his phone in growing alarm. He was beginning to understand that his morning mistake had set in motion forces that went far beyond normal military channels. The special operations community, operated by its own codes, valued different things than the regular military and had ways of expressing displeasure that didn't appear in any regulation manual. "Captain Moon," he said, his voice tight with stress, "I think I need your help." Irene studied Admiral Parker's face across the coffee shop table, seeing the dawning realization of what he'd set in motion. The carefully controlled world of naval aviation was colliding with the fierce loyalty of the special operations community, and he was caught directly in the middle. She'd seen this dynamic before, the tension between institutional authority and warrior culture, between following procedures and honoring the bonds forged in combat. "My help?" she asked quietly, setting down her untouched coffee. "Admiral, I'm not sure you understand what you're asking." Blake's phone buzzed again, and this time his expression grew even more concerned as he read the incoming message. "Sir, we now have reports of multiple special operations personnel arriving at the base without authorization. Security is requesting guidance on how to handle what appears to be an impromptu gathering." Parker felt the situation spiraling beyond his control. In his world of precise protocols and clear chains of command, this kind of organic response was foreign and potentially dangerous. "How many personnel are we talking about? The reports are still coming in, but..." Blake paused, checking another message. "At least 24 so far, representing multiple commands. SEALs from Little Creek, Rangers from Fort Bragg, Air Force Special Tactics from Pope. They're all requesting to speak with you about Captain Moon." Irene closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, Parker could see something that looked like pain. "This is exactly what I was hoping to avoid." "What do you mean?" "Admiral, the special operations community doesn't operate the way the regular military does. These aren't people who accept explanations about uniform regulations and proper procedures. They're warriors who've learned to trust their instincts about character and courage, and they've decided that what happened this morning was wrong. She stood up from the table, her movement decisive despite the weariness in her voice. They're not coming to your base to file complaints or request meetings through proper channels. They're coming to make a statement. Parker's phone rang again, this time the secure line connecting him directly to his command center. He answered it with growing dread. "Admiral, this is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell in operations. Sir, we have a situation at the main gate that requires your immediate attention." "What kind of situation, Commander?" "Sir, there are approximately 30 special operations personnel requesting entry to the base. They're all properly credentialed, but they're not on any official visit roster. The security team is asking for guidance." Parker looked at Irene, who was already gathering her things. "Tell them to hold everyone at the gate until I arrive. No one enters or leaves without my direct authorization." "Sir, there's one more thing. They're asking specifically to see Captain Moon. And sir, they're all wearing their dress uniforms." The significance of that detail hit Parker like a physical blow. Dress uniforms meant ceremony, formality, respect. These weren't casual visits or impromptu meetings. The special operations community was preparing to make a formal statement about how one of their own had been treated. Irene was already heading toward the door. "Admiral, if you want to prevent this from becoming something that neither of us can control, we need to get back to the base immediately." The drive back to Naval Air Station Oceana took place in tense silence, broken only by the constant buzzing of phones, receiving updates about the developing situation. Blake drove while monitoring radio traffic from the base security forces, his expression growing more concerned with each transmission. "Ghost 7, this is actual. Request immediate sit rep on your current location." The radio call was professional, but the use of Irene's call sign instead of her rank and name spoke volumes about how the special operations community viewed her status. To them, she wasn't just a retired Air Force captain, she was a legend whose reputation transcended normal military hierarchy. "They're treating this like a combat operation," Blake observed quietly. "Because to them, it is," Irene replied. "When someone attacks the reputation of a warrior who saved their brothers in arms, they don't see it as a bureaucratic dispute. They see it as a threat to everything they believe about honor and loyalty." As they approached the main gate, the scope of the situation became immediately apparent. The normally orderly entrance to Naval Air Station Oceana had been transformed into something resembling a military formation. 36 special operations personnel stood in precise ranks, their dress uniforms creating a sea of ribbons, badges, and insignia that represented decades of combat experience. At the front of the formation stood Master Chief Marcus Rodriguez, the SEAL, who'd called Parker earlier. Rodriguez was a legend in his own right, a career special operator whose chest displayed the Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor and numerous other decorations, earned in places that didn't officially exist on any map. But it was the man standing next to Rodriguez who made Admiral Parker's blood run cold. Captain James Reaper Monroe was the most decorated SEAL in active service, a man whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by his absolute intolerance for injustice. Monroe's presence meant that this wasn't just an informal gathering, it was an official response from the highest levels of the special operations community. As Parker's vehicle approached the gate, the formation came to attention with a precision that would have impressed drill instructors at any military academy. But there was something different about their bearing, something that spoke of shared purpose rather than mere military discipline. Parker stepped out of the car, immediately feeling the weight of 36 pairs of eyes, evaluating his every movement. These were men and women who'd spent their careers reading people in life-or-death situations, and he could sense their collective judgment settling around him like a physical presence. "Master Chief Rodriguez," Parker said formally, approaching the formation with Blake and Irene flanking him. "I understand you wanted to speak with me." Rodriguez stepped forward, his bearing respectful but unwavering. Admiral Parker, I'm here representing Naval Special Warfare Command, but I'm also speaking for every operator who's ever depended on air support in a combat zone. Captain Monroe moved to Rodriguez's side, his cold blue eyes fixed on Parker with laser intensity. Admiral, we've seen the video of this morning's incident. We're here to understand why Ghost 7 was ordered off your base. The use of Irene's call sign rather than her rank was deliberate, a signal that the Special Operations community recognized authority based on combat performance rather than bureaucratic position. Parker found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending institutional protocol to people who valued results over procedures. Gentlemen, there was a misunderstanding about uniform regulations that has since been clarified. Captain Moon and I have discussed the situation and, with respect, sir, Monroe interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command in the most dangerous places on Earth, this isn't about uniform regulations. He gestured toward the formation behind him, and Parker noticed for the first time that every single person present was wearing their combat action badge or equivalent decoration. These weren't rear echelon personnel or staff officers. They were the tip of the spear, the men and women who actually fought America's wars. This is about respect for warriors who've proven themselves under fire, Monroe continued. Ghost 7 saved 12 of our brothers when everyone else said it was impossible. She violated orders, crossed international boundaries, and risked her career to bring our people home. And this morning she was treated like a vagrant because her jacket didn't meet dress code standards. Irene stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension with calm authority. Captain Monroe, Master Chief Rodriguez, I appreciate what you're doing here, but this isn't necessary. Rodriguez turned toward her and his weathered face softened slightly. Ma'am, with all due respect, it is necessary. The Special Operations community takes care of its own, and we don't forget who was there when it mattered. The Kunar Province incident. Monroe added, his eyes never leaving Parker's face. Officially never happened. But 12 SEALs went home to their families because one pilot had the courage to do what was right instead of what was safe. Parker felt the weight of their collective stare, the judgment of men and women whose opinions were earned through blood and sacrifice rather than granted through rank and position. He realized that his carefully constructed world of regulations and procedures meant nothing to these people. They operated in a realm where character was the only currency that mattered. I've made a mistake, Parker said finally, his voice carrying across the formation with surprising clarity. I allowed procedure to override judgment, and I treated a genuine American hero with disrespect. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke. The only sound was the distant roar of aircraft engines from the flight line, a reminder of the larger purpose that brought them all together. Monroe stepped closer to Parker, his voice dropping to a register that was somehow more commanding for its quietness. Admiral, mistakes happen. What matters is how we handle them. What would you suggest, Captain? Monroe glanced back at the formation, then at Irene, who was watching the entire exchange with an expression that mixed resignation with something approaching sadness. We want Ghost 7 reinstated with full honors, Monroe said. We want her given the platform she deserves to share her knowledge with the next generation of warriors, and we want it understood throughout the military that combat heroes deserve respect regardless of what they're wearing or which boxes they check on administrative forms. Parker found himself nodding before he'd fully processed Monroe's words. The demands weren't unreasonable, they were simply asking for recognition of merit based on performance rather than conformity to bureaucratic standards. Captain Monroe, I don't have the authority to reinstate Captain Moon to active duty, but I can certainly arrange for her to have whatever platform she needs to share her expertise. That's a start, Rodriguez said, but there's something else. He gestured toward the formation, and one by one the Special Operations personnel began to move. Parker watched in growing amazement as they arranged themselves into a perfect ceremonial formation, with Monroe and Rodriguez at the front, and Irene positioned where she could see every face. "Ghost 7!" Monroe called out in the carrying voice of a man accustomed to commanding in combat. "Naval Special Warfare Command requests permission to render honors." What happened next would be talked about in military circles for decades to come. 36 of America's most elite warriors came to attention in perfect unison, their movement creating a sound like thunder rolling across the Virginia landscape. Then as one, they rendered the most precise military salute Parker had ever witnessed. The salute wasn't just about military courtesy, it was a statement of respect that transcended rank, service branch, and bureaucratic hierarchy. It was recognition of courage under fire, of the kind of moral leadership that couldn't be taught in any academy or written into any manual. Irene stood perfectly still for a moment, her composure finally beginning to crack. Parker could see tears forming in those gray-green eyes that had stared down enemy fighters over Afghanistan. When she returned the salute, her movement was crisp and professional, but there was something deeply emotional in the gesture, the acknowledgement of bonds forged in combat and tested by time. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice carrying clearly across the formation. "It has been an honor to serve with you all." The salute held for a full 30 seconds, an eternity in military time, before Monroe gave the command to order arms. As the formation relaxed, Parker realized that he'd just witnessed something extraordinary, a demonstration of the values that the military claimed to represent, but too often failed to practice. "Admiral," Monroe said, turning back toward Parker, "we hope this helps clarify the situation." Before Parker could respond, his phone rang with an incoming call from a number he immediately recognized: the Pentagon. The caller ID showed Vice Admiral Rebecca Thompson, but the timing suggested this call was coming from much higher up the chain of command. "Admiral Parker, this is General Patricia Hayes, Joint Chiefs of Staff. I'm calling about a video that's currently circulating throughout the Department of Defense. It shows what appears to be a significant gathering of Special Operations personnel at your facility." Parker glanced at the formation of elite warriors still standing at attention near his base's main gate, then at Irene, who was quietly observing the conversation with the calm expression of someone who'd seen institutional crises before. "Yes, ma'am. The situation is currently under control." "Good. Admiral, I'm going to speak plainly because I don't have time for diplomatic language. The video of your encounter with Captain Moon this morning has been seen by every flag officer in the building. The follow-up demonstration by Special Operations personnel has been noted at the highest levels of government." Parker felt his career hanging in the balance, suspended by threads of military courtesy and political calculation. "Ma'am, I take full responsibility for this morning's incident. Captain Moon was treated inappropriately, and I'm taking immediate steps to address the situation." "Admiral, let me explain something about Captain Moon that apparently wasn't in your morning briefing. She currently holds consulting contracts with 3 different commands, advises on tactical aviation doctrine at the War College, and has been personally requested by the Secretary of Defense to review Special Operations integration protocols." The general's voice carried the weight of institutional authority backed by political reality. "In other words, Admiral, you didn't just insult a war hero this morning. You interfered with someone whose expertise is considered essential to national security." Parker closed his eyes, feeling the full scope of his mistake finally coming into focus. He'd been so focused on enforcing minor regulations that he'd lost sight of the bigger picture, forgotten that the military's ultimate purpose was to defend the nation rather than to maintain bureaucratic order. "General, what would you recommend as appropriate corrective action?" "You're going to personally escort Captain Moon back onto your base, Admiral. You're going to provide her with whatever resources she needs to complete her consulting work. And you're going to make it clear to everyone involved that tactical innovation and combat experience are valued more highly than uniform conformity." Hayes paused, and Parker could hear voices in the background, the sound of high-level discussions about damage control and public relations. Furthermore, Admiral, I want Captain Moon to address your senior staff about decision-making under pressure. Her experiences in Afghanistan contain lessons that every flag officer needs to understand. This incident has created an opportunity for genuine learning, and we're going to take advantage of it. Parker looked at Irene, who had been listening to his side of the conversation with growing interest. For the first time since the morning's confrontation, she looked genuinely engaged, rather than simply resigned to institutional dysfunction. Ma'am, I'll make the arrangements immediately. Good. And Admiral, the next time you encounter someone whose service record you don't immediately recognize, I suggest you ask questions before issuing orders. Hayes out. The line went dead, leaving Parker standing before a formation of special operations personnel with new instructions that would require him to admit his mistake in the most public way possible. But as he looked at the faces surrounding him, warriors who'd risked everything in service of principles larger than themselves, he realized that public humility was a small price to pay for the chance to learn from genuine heroism. Captain Monroe, Master Chief Rodriguez, Parker said, his voice carrying across the formation. Would you and your personnel like to accompany Captain Moon and myself back to the base? I believe we have some important discussions to conduct. Monroe's cold expression finally softened into something approaching approval. Admiral, we'd be honored. As the formation began to move toward the base entrance, Parker found himself walking beside Irene, who was no longer the dismissed visitor from that morning, but something far more significant, a teacher whose lessons had been earned through fire and blood. Captain Moon, he said quietly, I hope you'll be willing to share your experiences with my senior staff. I think we have a lot to learn. Irene glanced at the special operations personnel surrounding them, at the base beyond the gate where young pilots were training for missions they couldn't yet imagine, at the institution that had both celebrated and punished her for the same act of courage. Admiral, she said, with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her all day, I think that's exactly why I'm here. The procession through Naval Air Station Oceana drew attention from every corner of the facility. Word of the special operations gathering had spread through the base's communication networks with characteristic military efficiency, and personnel were finding excuses to be outside as the formation moved toward the administrative building. Parker noticed the reactions of his own people, the mixture of curiosity, respect, and something approaching awe as they recognized the caliber of the personnel accompanying Irene back onto the base. These were legends, walking among them men and women whose exploits were whispered about in ready rooms and maintenance hangars across the world. As they approached the steps of the administrative building, Parker made a decision that would define the rest of his career. Instead of ushering everyone into a private meeting room, he stopped at the base of the steps and turned to face not just the special operations formation, but the growing crowd of his own personnel who had gathered to witness this unprecedented event. Ladies and gentlemen, Parker called out, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, I want to introduce you to Captain Irene Moon, call sign Ghost 7, one of the most decorated combat pilots in Air Force history. The words echoed across the base like a declaration of surrender, not to defeat but to a higher understanding of what military service truly meant. As applause began to ripple through the crowd, Parker realized that his morning mistake had become something far more valuable than mere damage control. It had become a lesson in leadership courage and the difference between following orders and serving a cause worth dying for. The applause that rippled across Naval Air Station Oceana seemed to hang in the Virginia air like the echo of distant thunder. As it gradually subsided, Admiral Parker found himself facing a moment that would either define his legacy or destroy it entirely. Standing before hundreds of personnel, his own sailors and airmen, alongside some of the most elite warriors in the American military, he understood that his next words would be remembered long after his retirement ceremony. 3 hours ago, Parker began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. I made a decision that I believed was correct. I enforced what I thought were important regulations, maintained what I considered proper standards, and acted according to procedures that have governed military installations for decades. The crowd was absolutely silent now, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Even the distant sound of aircraft engines seemed muted, as if the entire base was holding its breath. I was wrong, Parker continued, the words seeming to surprise him, even as he spoke them. Not because regulations don't matter, not because standards aren't important, but because I forgot the fundamental purpose those regulations are supposed to serve. Irene stood quietly beside him, her presence somehow both modest and commanding. She wasn't seeking vindication or revenge. Parker could see that in her expression. Instead, she was watching with the patient attention of someone who understood that real change happens slowly, one person at a time, through the accumulation of small moments of clarity. "Captain Moon," Parker said, turning toward her with a formality that was somehow more genuine than any casual interaction could have been. "Would you be willing to share with my personnel what you've learned about leadership under pressure?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and Parker realized he was asking for more than just a speech or a briefing. He was asking Irene to trust an institution that had both honored her service and punished her courage to believe that her hard-won wisdom could make a difference in the lives of people she'd never met. Irene looked out at the sea of faces surrounding them, young pilots who reminded her of herself. 20 years earlier, seasoned NCOs whose eyes held the weight of multiple deployments, staff officers whose decisions would ripple through countless lives. For a moment, she seemed to be weighing something more complex than a simple yes or no. "Admiral," she said finally, "I think that depends on whether your people are ready to hear about the times when following orders is the wrong thing to do." A murmur rippled through the crowd at her words. Military doctrine emphasized obedience to lawful orders as a cornerstone of discipline, yet here was a decorated combat veteran suggesting that sometimes disobedience was not only acceptable but necessary. Captain Monroe stepped forward from the Special Operations Formation, his voice cutting through the tension with the authority of someone who'd faced impossible choices in distant battlefields. "Ghost Number 7, he called out, using her call sign with deliberate emphasis. These people need to understand that courage isn't just about facing enemy fire. Sometimes it's about facing your own command structure when lives are on the line. The statement sent another ripple of tension through the assembled personnel. This wasn't abstract leadership theory. This was a direct challenge to one of the fundamental assumptions of military culture. Commander Blake, who'd been quietly observing the entire exchange, pulled out his tablet and activated the secure communication system that connected the base to higher command levels. What was happening here needed to be documented, preserved, and shared throughout the military education system. "Captain Moon," a voice called from the crowd. Parker turned to see Lieutenant Sarah Chen, one of his most promising young pilots, raising her hand with the nervous determination of someone who'd found the courage to ask the question everyone was thinking. "Ma'am, how do you know when orders are wrong? How do you distinguish between cowardice and conscience?" The question cut to the heart of military ethics, to the tension between individual moral responsibility and institutional authority. It was the kind of question that kept military ethicists awake at night and had no easy answers. Irene was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant as if she were seeing something beyond the present moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of personal experience rather than academic theory. "Lieutenant, that's the most important question any warrior will ever face, and unfortunately there's no checklist that can answer it for you." She moved slightly, positioning herself where she could see more of the assembled crowd. "In Afghanistan, when I heard Bravo Team's distress call, I had about 30 seconds to make a decision that would either save 12 lives or end my career, probably both. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the quiet intensity in her voice. This wasn't a sanitized after-action report or a scripted presentation. This was raw truth from someone who'd lived through the kind of moment that most people only read about. The orders were clear, Irene continued. Maintain patrol route, avoid the combat zone, don't violate Pakistani airspace under any circumstances. Those were good orders issued by competent commanders who understood the bigger picture better than I did. Lieutenant Chen looked confused. Then why did you disobey them? Because Irene said simply, I realized that following those orders meant accepting the death of 12 Americans when I had the power to prevent it. In that moment, the bigger picture became very small and very clear. Master Chief Rodriguez nodded approvingly from his position with the Special Operations Formation. Sometimes the mission changes even when the orders don't. Parker found himself thinking about his own career, about the countless times he'd faced decisions that required balancing competing priorities. But none of those decisions had involved immediate life or death consequences, and he was beginning to understand the fundamental difference between administrative leadership and combat leadership. Captain Moon, another voice called out. This time it was Chief Petty Officer Washington, the same man who'd first recognized her call sign that morning. What happened after you made that choice? How did you live with the consequences? The question seemed to catch Irene off guard, and for the first time since the confrontation began, her carefully maintained composure showed cracks. Her hands, which had remained steady throughout the entire ordeal, trembled slightly as she considered her response. Chief, that's the part they don't prepare you for in flight school, she said quietly. They teach you how to make split-second tactical decisions, how to manage fear under fire, how to execute complex missions under pressure, but they don't teach you how to live with being right for the wrong reasons. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Even the special operations personnel, men and women who'd faced their own impossible choices, were listening with the intensity of students rather than colleagues. I saved 12 lives that day. Irene continued, her voice growing stronger. 12 SEALs went home to their families because I chose to violate direct orders. But in doing so, I also violated international law, created a diplomatic incident, and established a precedent that could have led to other pilots making similar unauthorized decisions with catastrophic results. She paused, looking directly at Lieutenant Chen. The review board that disciplined me wasn't wrong to be concerned about those implications. Military discipline exists for good reasons, and the moment we start allowing individual judgment to override institutional authority, we risk chaos. Captain Monroe stepped forward again, his expression intense. But Ghost Tsufmpun, you're talking about the conflict between tactical and strategic thinking. In the moment, with limited information and time pressure, you made the best decision you could with the information you had. That's exactly right, Captain, Irene agreed. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. I wasn't just making a tactical decision. I was making a moral one. I was deciding that the lives of 12 Americans were worth more than diplomatic relationships, international law, and my own career. Admiral Parker felt something shift in his understanding as he listened to her words. This wasn't just about military decision-making. It was about the fundamental question of individual responsibility in the face of institutional authority. Was that the right choice? Lieutenant Chen asked. Irene smiled sadly. Lieutenant, if I knew the answer to that question with absolute certainty, I'd be a philosopher, not a pilot. What I can tell you is that it was the only choice I could live with. Commander Blake looked up from his tablet where he'd been taking notes throughout the entire exchange. Captain Moon, your decision-making process during Operation Firewall has been studied at the War College, hasn't it? It has, she confirmed. Both as an example of tactical innovation and as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unauthorized action. Depending on who's teaching the class, I'm either a hero or a rogue pilot who got lucky. Which interpretation do you think is correct? Blake pressed. Irene considered the question for a long moment, her gaze sweeping across the faces surrounding her. I think both interpretations miss the point. The real lesson isn't about whether I was right or wrong. It's about developing the kind of judgment that allows you to make difficult decisions under pressure and live with the consequences. She gestured toward the special operations personnel who'd gathered to support her. These men and women understand something that the regular military sometimes forgets. In combat, there's often no perfect choice, no solution that satisfies all competing interests. There's only the choice you can make with the information you have and the values you hold. Master Chief Rodriguez spoke up from the formation. Ma'am, that's what we try to teach our people, how to think under pressure, how to adapt when the plan falls apart, how to lead when there's no one to tell you what to do. Exactly, Irene agreed. But the military as a whole has become increasingly focused on process rather than outcome, on following procedures rather than achieving objectives. We've created a culture where covering your own back is more important than taking calculated risks. Admiral Parker felt those words like a physical blow. He thought about his own leadership style, his emphasis on regulations and procedures, his instinctive distrust of anything that deviated from established protocols. Had he become so focused on avoiding mistakes that he'd forgotten how to recognize excellence? Captain Moon, he said carefully, what would you recommend for developing that kind of judgment in our personnel? The question drew approving nods from the Special Operations contingent. This was what they'd been hoping for, not just an apology or a gesture of respect, but a genuine commitment to learning from Irene's experience. Admiral, judgment can't be taught from a textbook or memorized from a manual, Irene replied. It has to be developed through experience, through facing progressively more complex challenges with appropriate support and guidance. She turned to address the crowd more broadly. How many of you have been in situations where the standard procedures didn't cover what you were facing? A significant number of hands went up throughout the assembled personnel. Parker was surprised to see that even some of his most junior sailors were raising their hands. That's normal, Irene continued. The real world is messy, complicated, unpredictable. But instead of teaching people how to think through novel problems, we often just create more procedures to cover every possible contingency. Lieutenant Chen raised her hand again. Ma'am, how do we balance independent thinking with military discipline? It was the fundamental question that had been underlying the entire conversation, and Parker found himself leaning forward to hear Irene's response. Lieutenant, discipline isn't about blind obedience. It's about having the training and character to do the right thing even when it's difficult or dangerous. Real military discipline means being so thoroughly grounded in your values and your training that you can adapt to any situation while still serving the larger mission. Captain Monroe nodded approvingly. In special operations, we call it disciplined initiative. We train our people to understand the commander's intent so thoroughly that they can make independent decisions that support the overall objective, even when they can't communicate with higher command. That's exactly right, Irene agreed. But disciplined initiative requires two things that are often lacking in the broader military culture. First, it requires commanders who are willing to trust their subordinates to make good decisions. Second, it requires subordinates who are willing to accept responsibility for the consequences of those decisions. Admiral Parker felt the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy cloak. How many times had he micromanaged his subordinates, second-guessed their decisions, or created additional layers of approval to avoid taking responsibility for potential mistakes? Captain Moon, he said quietly, would you be willing to work with my staff to develop training programs that emphasize that kind of decision-making? The question surprised him even as he asked it. An hour earlier, he'd been focused on maintaining order and enforcing regulations. Now he was asking a woman he'd dismissed from his base to help reshape his entire approach to leadership development. Irene studied his face with those penetrating gray-green eyes, as if she were trying to read his soul. Admiral, that would depend on whether you're ready to accept some uncomfortable truths about how this institution actually functions. What kind of truths? The truth that courage is often punished while conformity is rewarded. The truth that we promote people for avoiding mistakes rather than for achieving excellence. The truth that our current system is better at creating managers than leaders. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, the assembled personnel waited to see how their commanding officer would respond to such a direct critique of military culture. Parker looked out at the faces surrounding him, his own people and the special operations personnel who'd come to defend one of their own. He thought about his own career, about the compromises he'd made and the opportunities he'd missed to stand up for what was right rather than what was safe. "Captain Moon," he said finally, "I think those are exactly the truths we need to hear." The response drew a murmur of surprise from the crowd. This wasn't the careful diplomatic language they'd expected from a flag officer. It was an admission that the current system wasn't working as well as it should. Commander Blake looked up from his tablet again. "Sir, I'm receiving reports that this conversation is being monitored at the highest levels. Word is spreading throughout the Department of Defense about what's happening here." Parker nodded, unsurprised. In the modern military, nothing stayed secret for long, especially when it involved high-profile personnel and controversial subjects. "Good," he said simply. "Maybe it's time for this conversation to happen at those levels." Irene smiled, the first genuine expression of pleasure Parker had seen from her all day. "Admiral, I think that's exactly the kind of leadership the military needs." Captain Monroe stepped forward from the Special Operations Formation. "Charmaster 7, if you're willing to take on this kind of consulting work, you'll have the full support of the Special Operations community. We've been arguing for these changes for years." "What kind of changes?" Lieutenant Chen asked. Monroe's expression grew serious. "Changes that prioritize mission accomplishment over risk avoidance. Changes that reward innovation rather than punishing deviation from standard procedures. Changes that develop leaders who can think for themselves instead of just following checklists." Master Chief Rodriguez nodded agreement. "We've lost too many good people not to enemy action, but to bureaucratic paralysis. People who could have made a difference if they'd been allowed to use their judgment, instead of waiting for permission." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a black sedan with government plates. As it pulled up to the administrative building, Parker recognized the passenger as Rear Admiral Patricia Vance, Director of Naval Aviation Training. Her presence meant that word of the morning's events had reached the highest levels of the Navy's aviation community. Admiral Vance stepped out of the sedan and surveyed the scene before her. Hundreds of personnel gathered around a controversial Air Force captain, special operations personnel standing in formation, and her own subordinate engaged in what appeared to be a public examination of military leadership philosophy. "Admiral Parker," she called out as she approached the group, "I think we need to discuss the situation you've created here." Parker felt his stomach tighten. Rear Admiral Vance was known throughout the naval aviation community as a brilliant officer and a fierce defender of institutional standards. Her arrival could signal either support for the changes being discussed or a return to traditional approaches. "Ma'am," Parker replied formally, "I was just discussing leadership development with Captain Moon and some visiting personnel." Vance's gaze moved to Irene, and for a moment the two women studied each other with the careful attention of professionals, evaluating a potential ally or threat. "Captain Moon," Vance said finally, "I've read your file. Your tactics during Operation Firewall have been analyzed by every tactical development command in the military." "Yes, ma'am," Irene replied carefully. "I understand the mission has generated considerable discussion." Discussion. Vance's expression shifted slightly. "Captain, your approach to close air support in complex terrain has revolutionized how we think about fighter employment in support of ground operations. The techniques you developed during that engagement are now standard doctrine for similar situations." The statement sent a ripple of surprise through the assembled crowd. They'd been focused on the disciplinary aspects of Irene's story, but Rear Admiral Vance was highlighting something different, the tactical innovation that had emerged from that desperate 17-minute engagement. "What Admiral Vance isn't mentioning," Captain Monroe added with obvious pride, "is that Ghost 7's techniques have been adopted by Special Operations Forces worldwide. Her integration of air and ground tactics has saved countless lives in subsequent operations." Irene looked uncomfortable with the praise, but Vance pressed forward. "Captain Moon, the Secretary of the Navy, has asked me to extend an invitation for you to address the Naval War College about decision-making under extreme pressure. Your experience represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need to develop in our officer corps." Admiral Parker felt a sudden shift in the dynamic of the conversation. What had started as damage control over a uniform violation was evolving into something much larger, a discussion about fundamental changes in military culture and training. "Ma'am," he said to Vance, "Captain Moon has agreed to work with my staff on leadership development programs. I believe her expertise could benefit our entire command." Vance nodded approvingly. "Admiral, that's exactly the kind of initiative we need to see more of. The Chief of Naval Operations has made it clear that innovation and adaptive thinking are priorities for the entire service." She turned back to Irene. "Captain, would you be willing to extend your consulting work beyond this single command? There are flag officers throughout the Navy who could benefit from your perspective on leadership under pressure." Irene looked out at the assembled crowd, at the mixture of eager young faces and experienced veterans, at the special operations personnel who'd risked their careers to defend her reputation. For the first time since her retirement, she saw the possibility of making a real difference in how the military prepared its people for the challenges they would face. "Admiral Vance," she said slowly, "I think that depends on whether the Navy is ready to hear some uncomfortable truths about how we actually prepare people for combat leadership." "What kind of truths?" Irene's smile was both sad and determined. "The truth that following procedures isn't the same as accomplishing the mission. The truth that avoiding risk isn't the same as being responsible. The truth that real leadership sometimes requires the courage to fail publicly rather than succeed privately." Rear Admiral Vance was quiet for a long moment, considering Irene's words. Around them, the crowd waited to see whether the Navy's senior leadership would embrace the kind of honest self-examination that Irene was proposing. "Captain Moon," Vance said finally, "I think those are exactly the truths we need to hear, and I think it's time we started listening." The words marked a turning point, not just in the day's events, but in something much larger. What had begun as a simple confrontation over dress codes was becoming a catalyst for examining fundamental questions about military culture, leadership development, and the balance between individual initiative and institutional authority. As the crowd began to disperse, moving toward scheduled duties with a sense that they'd witnessed something historic, Admiral Parker found himself walking beside Irene toward the administrative building where her real work would begin. "Captain," he said quietly, "I want to thank you for giving us the chance to learn from your experience." Irene glanced back at the special operations personnel who were finally beginning to relax their formal posture, at the young sailors and airmen who were returning to their duties with new questions about leadership and courage at the institution that had both celebrated and punished her for the same act of heroism. "Admiral," she replied, "I think we're all about to learn together." 3 years after that transformative morning at Naval Air Station Oceana, Colonel Irene Moon stood in the briefing room of the Pentagon's E-Ring, addressing an audience that would have been unimaginable during her days as a dismissed Air Force captain. The room was filled with flag officers from every service branch, senior officials from allied nations, and representatives from the most elite military units in the world. But what made the moment truly extraordinary wasn't the rank of her audience. It was the fundamental shift in military thinking that her story had helped catalyze. The journey from that coffee shop confrontation with Admiral Parker to this pinnacle of military influence had been neither straight nor simple. In the months following the Oceana incident, Irene had found herself at the center of a quiet revolution in military education and doctrine. Her consulting work had expanded from single-base visits to comprehensive reviews of leadership development across all service branches. The uncomfortable truths she'd promised to share had proven more transformative than anyone had anticipated. "Ladies and gentlemen," Irene began, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had sustained her through 17 minutes of impossible combat. "When I was asked to leave Naval Air Station Oceana for wearing the wrong jacket, I thought my military career was truly over. What I didn't understand was that it was actually just beginning." Admiral Parker, now wearing the 3 stars of a vice admiral and serving as Director of Military Personnel Policy, sat in the front row with an expression of quiet pride. The man who had once dismissed her as a uniform violation had become one of her strongest advocates, using his position to implement the cultural changes they'd discussed that day on the Virginia tarmac. "The incident at Oceana taught us something crucial about military culture," Irene continued. "We had created a system that was so focused on conformity and risk avoidance that we were systematically discouraging the very qualities we needed most in our leaders' initiative: moral courage and the willingness to take calculated risks in service of the mission." In the 3 years since that confrontation, those lessons had rippled through the military establishment with effects that surprised even their advocates. The changes hadn't happened overnight, and they certainly hadn't happened without resistance. Traditional military culture was deeply embedded, reinforced by decades of institutional momentum and the natural human tendency to equate following rules with doing right. But the video of Admiral Parker's confrontation with Ghost 7 had done something that no amount of academic argument could have accomplished. It had made the abstract, concrete turned philosophical discussions about leadership into a visceral demonstration of what was wrong with military culture. The sight of decorated special operations personnel saluting a woman who'd been dismissed for a uniform violation had forced the military establishment to confront some uncomfortable questions about its priorities and values. General Patricia Hayes, now serving as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had seized on those questions as an opportunity for fundamental reform. The Ghost 7 initiative, as it had come to be known throughout the Department of Defense, represented the most comprehensive examination of military leadership development since the Goldwater-Nichols Act. The traditional military model, Irene explained to her Pentagon audience, emphasized obedience and conformity as the primary virtues of good soldiers. But modern warfare requires something different: leaders who can think critically, adapt quickly, and make sound moral decisions under extreme pressure. Captain Monroe, now promoted to Admiral and serving as commander of Special Operations Command, nodded approvingly from his seat near the back of the room. The Special Operations community had been the first to embrace Irene's teachings, incorporating her decision-making frameworks into their selection and training programs. The results had been measurable: improved mission success rates, reduced civilian casualties, and more effective integration between special operations forces and conventional military units. The changes we've implemented over the past 3 years represent a fundamental shift in how we think about military leadership, Irene continued. Instead of training people to follow checklists, we're teaching them to understand principles. Instead of punishing mistakes, we're creating environments where calculated risks are encouraged and learning from failure is expected. The transformation hadn't been limited to American forces. NATO allies had observed the changes in U.S. military effectiveness and requested similar training programs for their own personnel. The principles that Irene had developed, what military educators now called adaptive leadership doctrine, were being taught in military academies from Annapolis to Sandhurst to the École Militaire in Paris. But perhaps the most significant change had been in how the military handled moral and ethical decision-making. The old model had essentially been follow orders, trust the chain of command, and let higher authority worry about the big picture. The new approach recognized that modern warfare often required junior leaders to make complex moral judgments with limited information and no time for consultation with superiors. Operation Firewall became our case study, Irene explained, not because my decision was necessarily right or wrong, but because it illustrated the kind of moral complexity that modern military leaders face on a regular basis. The Afghan engagement that had ended her active duty career had been declassified and thoroughly analyzed as part of the Ghost 7 initiative. Military ethicists, tactical experts, and international law specialists had dissected every aspect of her decision-making process, creating a comprehensive framework for understanding when individual moral judgment should override institutional authority. The conclusions had been both sobering and liberating. The review had determined that Irene's actions, while technically violations of several regulations and international agreements, had been ethically sound and tactically brilliant. More importantly, the analysis had revealed that the military's existing systems for handling moral complexity were woefully inadequate for the realities of modern conflict. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, the young pilot who had asked the crucial question that day at Oceana, now served as director of the Air Force's new Center for Ethical Leadership. Her own career had been transformed by the conversation she'd witnessed, leading her to pursue advanced studies in military ethics and decision theory. The Ghost 7 protocols, Chen had written in a recent journal article, represent the most significant advance in military leadership development since the establishment of professional military education. By teaching leaders to think through moral and tactical complexity rather than simply follow predetermined procedures, we're creating a more effective and ethically grounded military force. The protocols themselves were elegant in their simplicity. Rather than adding more rules and regulations, they focused on teaching core principles and decision-making frameworks that could be applied across a wide range of situations. The emphasis was on developing judgment rather than memorizing procedures, on understanding intent rather than following orders blindly. The most important lesson, Irene told her Pentagon audience, is that courage and competence are not separate qualities. They're inseparable aspects of effective leadership. You cannot have one without the other. The assembled flag officers listened with the attention of students rather than superiors. Many of them had been skeptical when the Ghost 7 initiative was first proposed, concerned that it would undermine military discipline and create a generation of insubordinate officers. Instead, they had seen improvements in virtually every metric of military effectiveness, from unit cohesion to mission success rates to public confidence in the military as an institution. Master Chief Rodriguez, now serving as the senior enlisted advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had become one of the program's most effective advocates within the non-commissioned officer community. His endorsement had been crucial in overcoming resistance from senior NCOs who worried that emphasizing individual judgment would undermine the authority of experienced enlisted leaders. The beauty of the Ghost 7 approach, Rodriguez had explained in congressional testimony, is that it doesn't replace traditional military discipline, it enhances it. When people understand why they're being asked to do something, when they're trained to think through complex problems, they become more effective at accomplishing the mission, not less. The congressional testimony had been part of a broader effort to institutionalize the changes beyond the military itself. The Ghost 7 protocols were now being studied by civilian organizations, as well police departments, emergency response teams, Corporate leadership programs and even educational institutions were adapting Irene's frameworks for their own use. But it was the international adoption of the protocols that had truly validated their significance. When the British Special Air Service began incorporating Ghost 7 decision-making frameworks into their selection process, when German special forces requested joint training exercises focused on adaptive leadership, when Israeli military academies invited Irene to lecture on moral courage under fire, it became clear that her story had resonated far beyond American military circles. Today, Irene announced to her Pentagon audience, "I'm pleased to report that the Ghost 7 protocols have been formally adopted by all NATO Special Operations Forces and are being integrated into the standard curriculum at military academies throughout the alliance." The announcement drew sustained applause from the assembled officers. What had begun as a confrontation over dress codes had evolved into a fundamental transformation of how free nations prepared their warriors for the moral and tactical complexity of modern conflict. Admiral Parker, reflecting on the journey from that morning at Oceana to this moment in the Pentagon, felt a profound sense of personal transformation. His own leadership style had been completely reformed by his encounter with Irene and his subsequent study of the principles she represented. The rigid adherence to regulations that had once defined his approach had been replaced by a more nuanced understanding of when rules served their purpose and when they became obstacles to effectiveness. The most significant change, he had written in his own contribution to the military literature on the subject, has been in how we think about failure and risk. Instead of creating systems designed to avoid mistakes, we're now focused on creating learning environments where calculated risks are encouraged and failure is treated as valuable data rather than career-ending disaster. The transformation hadn't been without its critics. Some traditionalists argued that the emphasis on individual judgment would lead to chaos, that military effectiveness depended on unquestioning obedience to legitimate authority. But the data didn't support their concerns. Units trained in Ghost 7 protocols showed better discipline, not worse, the discipline that came from understanding and commitment rather than mere compliance. More importantly, the changes had begun to address some of the military's most persistent problems. Suicide rates among military personnel had decreased as people felt more empowered to seek help and address problems creatively. Retention rates had improved as high-quality personnel felt more valued and engaged. Public confidence in military leadership had increased as citizens saw evidence of principled decision-making and moral courage. The ghost patch that started all this, Irene said, touching the worn fabric on her dress uniform jacket, represented something that the military establishment had forgotten: that individual moral courage is not a threat to institutional authority, but its strongest foundation. The patch itself had become a symbol of the transformation. Military personnel throughout the services had begun wearing replica Ghost 7 patches as a reminder of the principles they represented. The sight of that faded silhouette of an F-22 Raptor had become associated with the highest ideals of military service. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source. The families of the 12 SEALs who had been saved during Operation Firewall had established a scholarship fund for military personnel pursuing advanced education in ethics and leadership. The Ghost 7 Memorial Scholarship had become one of the most prestigious awards in military academia, recognizing not academic achievement, but moral courage in the face of institutional pressure. When I made the decision to violate orders over Kunar province, Irene told her audience, "I thought I was ending my military career. What I actually did was begin a conversation about what military service really means in a free society." As her presentation drew to a close, Irene looked out at the assembled flag officers and senior officials who would be responsible for implementing these principles throughout their commands. She saw in their faces the same transformation she had witnessed in Admiral Parker 3 years earlier, the recognition that leadership was about more than rank and authority, that true military effectiveness required moral courage and intellectual honesty. The lessons of Ghost 7 are simple, she concluded. Courage and competence are inseparable. Individual moral judgment is not the enemy of institutional authority, but its most reliable ally. And sometimes the most important thing a leader can do is have the wisdom to admit when they're wrong and the humility to learn from those they lead. The standing ovation that followed was more than mere politeness. It was recognition of a fundamental shift in military culture that would continue to ripple through the armed forces for generations to come. As the applause gradually subsided, General Hayes stepped to the podium to make the announcement that everyone in the room had been anticipating. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to announce that the Secretary of Defense has approved the establishment of the Ghost 7 Institute for Military Leadership at the National Defense University. Colonel Moon will serve as its first director, and the institute will be responsible for developing and implementing adaptive leadership curricula throughout the Department of Defense. The announcement marked the full institutionalization of the principles that had emerged from that morning confrontation at Naval Air Station Oceana. What had begun as a personal conflict between an admiral focused on regulations and a veteran wearing the wrong jacket had evolved into a comprehensive transformation of military culture. As the ceremony concluded and the assembled officers began to disperse, Admiral Parker approached Irene with the same formal respect he had struggled to show her 3 years earlier. But now the respect was genuine, earned through years of working together to implement changes that neither of them could have imagined during their first encounter. "Colonel Moon," he said, "I want you to know that dismissing you from my base was the best mistake I ever made." Irene smiled, the same calm expression that had sustained her through combat missions and congressional hearings alike. "Admiral, I think we both learned that sometimes the most important leadership decisions look like mistakes until history has time to judge them properly." They stood together for a moment, looking out through the Pentagon's windows at the Virginia landscape where their story had begun. In the distance, aircraft from nearby military installations continued their training missions, carrying pilots who would benefit from lessons learned through conflict failure and the courage to admit when fundamental changes were necessary. The transformation of military culture that had begun with a confrontation over dress codes had become something far more significant, a demonstration that institutions could change, that leadership could be taught, and that individual moral courage could indeed reshape the larger systems it served. The morning Admiral Parker had ordered Captain Irene Moon off his base for wearing an unauthorized jacket had marked the beginning of the most comprehensive reform of military leadership development in modern history. The legend of Ghost 7 was no longer just a story whispered in special operations communities. It had become the foundation for a new understanding of what it meant to serve with honor in the defense of freedom. Réveillé.